All right, welcome to the Week 10 Forum. This week we're dealing with Chapter 8, and we're going to learn about interest groups and the role that interest groups play as kind of the squeaky wheel of politics. The opening story is about Ben Brown, a 25-year-old physics graduate who read a newspaper article, quote, from former Wyoming Senator Alan Simpson, who claimed that until a young person could walk into his office and say, "I'm from the American Association of Young People. We have 30 million members and we're watching you, Simpson." What that story reveals is, part of the challenge of democratic governance. People with more money matter more, and people that care more and get organized matter more than other people in affluent democratic societies. The reality is that two groups of Americans lack interest group representation: young people and poor people. We can discuss why that is if any of you are interested. The emergence of interest groups in American politics was foreshadowed by James Madison in Federalist 10. He viewed faction as one of the unfortunate implications of democracy. And what he meant was that given freedom, people will bond together with other like-minded people in an attempt to influence the government to work to their advantage. The principal remedy to that problem, or the kind of intuitive remedy, would be to ban collusion, but that's so undemocratic and largely is a cure worse than the disease. Madison argued that size was the secret to creating a sustainable democratic republic. A large, diverse nation will create a large, diverse set of interests, and no one interest or even collection of interests could possibly wield sufficient influence to corrupt the government. Do we still believe that Madison was right about that? Are some interests kind of reaching the point where they have managed to, control vast swaths of the American state? Let's talk a little bit about the different kinds of interest groups out there. One thing that has happened as a direct result of the change in the relationship between the federal, state, and local governments is that we increasingly see activity from collections of public institutions. Think about the National Governors Association or the National Association of Mayors and so on, National Association of City Managers. These groups exist because the ability of those officials to do their jobs effectively is increasingly influenced by the policy decisions made at the federal level. And so city managers, mayors, governors, and other public officials at the state and local level oftentimes will band together and try to lobby Congress and the president to work, the system to their advantage. So what are some other varieties of interest groups? What are the more influential interest groups? Just about everybody knows about the National Rifle Association, for example. Did you know that the NRA has been around since the post-Civil War era? It was formed by, or organized, I should say, by a former Union general named Ambrose Burnside. He of the vast mutton chop, whatever you call those sideburns. He helped form the NRA because he believed that poor marksmanship among Union soldiers had added years to the war. Up until the 1970s, the NRA was basically an interest group for shooters and hunters, for people that like to shoot skeet, or people that hunted deer or elk or things like that. What changed? How is the NRA different from the NRA of the 1970s? My father was a member of the NRA. I think the text authors characterize the NRA as sort of a single interest group, which means that the NRA focuses on what? They focus on maximizing people's access to guns. Now, of course, there's a lot of stuff in their magazines that deal with things like how to be a better hunter, or how to be a better shooter. But at the same time, as an interest group, it has increasingly become primarily a vehicle for arms manufacturers to create a relatively unregulated environment for gun ownership. And that's part of the reason why we have over 350 million guns in the United States, more guns than people. Political scientists agree that economic interest groups are the best organized and influential of the interest groups. An example of an economic interest group on the liberal side are labor unions, and groups like Prosperity for America or the Business Roundtable are conservative interest groups. The reason economic interest groups tend to be stronger and more influential than other groups is that money is vital for purchasing the things needed to influence politics. And the two most important things are what? Expertise and access. With money, interest groups can hire lobbyists who have the access to elected officials and who are often former members of Congress with extensive experience with the legislative branch. Many people leave presidential administrations or executive branch agencies to specialize in lobbying the executive branch as well. The author's quote from the late American political scientist E.E. Schattschneider, who criticized the influence of what he called special interests or pressure groups back in the mid-20th century. He argued that the flaw in the pluralist heaven is that the heavenly chorus sings with a strong upper class accent. That quote can be found on page 259. What did Schattschneider mean by the pluralist heaven? Many American political scientists of his era, the mid-20th century, they adhered to this idea of pluralism, which was sort of in the Madisonian tradition, that interest groups could actually be a good thing. They mobilized Americans, they helped identify important concerns, and most importantly, those interests had a tendency to balance out other interests, so that government was in a position to act simply as a neutral referee in adjudicating conflicting demands. Schattschneider argued at the time that pluralism didn't create this countervailing pressure on government, but rather strongly influenced the federal government to govern in ways that were congenial to wealthier Americans. Was he wrong then? Is he wrong now? What do you think? In order to mobilize, interest groups require certain resources, which I mentioned a little while ago, primarily money, as noted above. Money enables you to rent offices, hire lobbyists, establish a permanent presence in Washington, D.C., or whatever state capitals where state policy might interest your group. The authors make an important distinction between membership and staff organizations. What's important about that distinction? One of the biggest challenges to effective interest group activity lies in overcoming what is known as the free rider problem. What exactly is a free rider? How does it threaten to undermine the kinds of interest group activity we're discussing this week? And how do interest groups overcome the free rider problem? In simple terms, free riding means what? If I don't participate but nevertheless benefit from a group's activity, why would I join? Why would I commit my time or energy or money? Right? That can be corrosive of interest groups getting the job done. So interest groups have to do what? They have to create kind of selective incentives that don't necessarily cost a lot, but that are going to increase the likelihood of people to participate. I could talk more about that if you want. The authors note that the internet has altered the way that interest groups foster participation. What innovations have liberal groups like MoveOn.org or conservative groups like Americans for Prosperity used to expand their membership and their fundraising? To illustrate the importance of online fundraising, what is the criterion being employed by the Democratic Party to determine which presidential candidates of the 20 or so now that are currently running, which of those candidates get to make the stage for their televised debates? How much money are presidential candidates now feeling like they have to raise through small donations on the internet? That's increasingly becoming a consequential measure of a campaign's viability. I think that's probably going to continue into the future. The last issue I want to address briefly are the strategies that interest groups employ to mobilize public opinion in their favor. If you watch much TV here in Oklahoma, for example, you will encounter what are known as institutional advertising from the oil and gas industry, telling you what a great job they're doing in cleaning up old drilling sites and keeping the air clean and all this other kind of stuff. They do this even in a state that is an oil state, right? They spend a lot of money trying to reinforce that positive image. What does that tell you? That they're committing money in a state like this, where everybody pretty much agrees with them, right? I mean, one thing it suggests is that the oil and gas industry knows how quickly public opinion can turn if they happen to be caught doing something wrong. All right, So I hope I've given you enough to think about to help you participate in this week's forum. As always, if you have any questions, please bring them to the forum. If there's anything that you found particularly interesting or, again, particularly difficult, let me know. Let's have a great week of discussion.